Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. It's so great to have Jason Isralowitz with me today. He has been a practicing attorney for 3 decades and a giant cinema buff ever since seeing Jaws and The Omen on the big screen at the age of 7. He also heads a New York high school mentoring program, which pairs his firm with a Bronx school for moot court and mock trial competitions. And he is here to talk about his book, entitled Nothing to Fear, Alfred Hitchcock and the Wrong Men. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yes, for sure. So let me start by asking you this. What were you first aware of? The Alfred Hitchcock film, The Wrong Man, or the actual case it was based on?
It was the film for sure. I was not familiar with the underlying case, even though it was, it did get a lot of media attention in New York at the time in the 50s. But the book, I have to say, started more with my admiration for the films of Hitchcock than for my familiarity with the case. I mean, I've always loved Hitchcock's movies, and after going to law school, I was interested in the way that he depicted issues of law and justice. But it wasn't until I saw The Wrong Man, about 5 years ago, that the idea for this book was born. And that's really what stoked my interest in learning more about the case. The movie and the case date back to the 1950s. And even though the movie was made in 1956, I was really struck by how urgent and timely it feels today. It's really this haunting story of a miscarriage of justice, and one of Hitchcock's more obscure films. So I was interested from that, just in the idea of drawing attention to the film, but it was really the case itself and the significance of the case that drew me into this project. I mean, the story is a universal story, really a universal nightmare of what it feels like to be falsely accused of a crime. And I wanted to learn, after seeing the movie, I really wanted to learn more about the underlying case and what led to the arrest and prosecution of the film's protagonist, Manny Balestrero. What went wrong with the criminal justice system that could lead to that result? So it was really the film first that drew me into the case.
Right. So this is a story that centers around an eyewitness misidentification. And to really put what happened into context, you cover in your book examples of other cases involving misidentification that preceded this one. Would you talk about the important ones and why they matter to this story?
Yes. The Balestrero case, which is the basis of the film, that took place in 1953. But in sort of digging into the research, if you look at the period leading up to the case, and I kind of focused on the 15 years before that, you can see that Manny Balestrero's ordeal reflected the continuation of a series of systemic problems with the criminal justice system that had been around for a long time. So that was part of what I wanted to do with the first part of the book. Before I got to Manny's story, I wanted to contextualize it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the legal environment at the time and what the legal environment was really all about at that point in terms of eyewitness identification was that it was not a very well-developed system. There were really no established legal norms governing the process by which eyewitness identifications were solicited. And so you had a number of cases that arose before Manny's case that themselves were really became notorious wrong man cases. Probably the most famous, the one I spend the most time on, involved a stockbroker named Bertram Campbell, who in 1938 was misidentified as the front man for a forgery gang. And if you look at that case, you can see a combination of two factors at work that I believe led to the false imprisonment of Bertram Campbell and other defendants during that period. The first was there was really this kind of exalting of eyewitness testimony, that there was a sense that, eyewitness testimony was infallible. It was really elevated to the point where eyewitness accusations almost, received a presumption of validity by the authorities. And so in the case of Bertram Campbell, there were 5 eyewitnesses who identified him as a man who had, posing as someone else, established phony accounts at banks and then deposited forged checks. From the allegations of the eyewitnesses themselves, you had this sense that, the defendant's fate was sealed. But then you had sort of the complementary problem that the identification procedures that were used by police and by prosecutors were very prejudicial. Essentially, the ideal today of, the idea that, you might use a lineup to test the validity of an eyewitness identification, and you would use people, you would fill that lineup with people who resemble the defendant. That, was really not the practice back at the time. In fact, what happened to Bertram Campbell and a number of other defendants was they were subjected to what are called show-ups, which is the phrase that's used to describe the display of a suspect alone before the eyewitness, so that it's sort of inherently suggestive, because essentially it's conveying to the eyewitness that this is the person that the police believe to be the suspect. So you had a combination of, this kind of false presumption that eyewitnesses were generally infallible, and then you had procedures that were being used that were themselves prejudicial to suspects. So there are a number of cases I talk about, mistaken identity cases, where innocent defendants were sent to prison based on, a combination of these factors.
So Christopher Manny Balestrero, he had a very interesting background. He was a musician who played at the extremely famous Stork Club in New York City, and his parents were Italian immigrants. Tell us more about him, if you don't mind, about he and his wife, Rose, and their family, and what their life was like just before the world came crashing down on them.
Sure. So Manny was born in 1909 to, as you say, immigrant parents from Italy. And really, when Manny was still young, the family returns to Italy because his father had not yet established American citizenship, and he was drafted into the army in Italy as a translator for the Italian army. So the Balestreros go back to Italy and are there during World War I. And then they immigrate back to Manhattan in 1920. And they live in Manhattan for some period, and then later move on over to Union City, New Jersey. Manny's father was a freight elevator operator, but he also kind of moonlighted as a musician in a local band. And Manny himself was a music prodigy. He started playing the violin when he was only 5. He learned to play the saxophone on his own, the clarinet, and later in life learned the double bass, which became the instrument of choice. But basically, as a teenager, he was so advanced that he was already playing in his father's band, and it was as a result of his work in these bands that he met his wife Rose in 1930. The band was playing an Italian affair. And that's where we met Rose. And, within 2 years of that, they were married at the age of 22. Manny and Rose then moved to Jackson Heights, Queens. They moved into a house that's owned by Rose's father. Rose's sister and her husband live on one floor. Manny and Rose live upstairs. Rose is a dressmaker. Manny continues to play various musical gigs. He joins a musicians union, which leads to a lot of jobs. And they start raising a family. Their first son is born in 1940, Robert. Then Greg, their second son, is born in 47. And by 1951, Manny's musical career has advanced to the point where, as you say, he's got this job in the rumba band at the Store Club. And, the Store Club itself is its own kind of fascinating story of a nightclub that was just it was really the epicenter of glitz and glamour and celebrity for quite a while between the 1930s and the 1950s. I don't know if you know the history of it, but as I understand it, it was originally came into being in the during the Prohibition era as a speakeasy. At one point, it was shut down by Prohibition agents, and then it reopened. And at some point in the 1930s, the owner's name was Sherman Billingsley, who was running it. And at some point in the 30s, he got a mention. The Store Club got a mention in a column by Walter Winchell, nationally syndicated columnist. And at that point, it sort of took off as this incredible magnet for celebrities, for politicians. It was, you'd see people, the celebrities who would show up, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio and Hitchcock himself, before he filmed The Wrong Man, before he had any connection in his films of the Store Club, he visited the nightclub there. Hemingway, all kinds of famous people routinely visited the Store Club. So in 1951 and 52, basically before, the world collapses for Manny, he's got a good job at one of the most famous night spots in America. He's got a family, and all seems right with the world.
Exactly, right. So he was known as a gentle soul, right? By friends, family, coworkers, not a troublemaker.
Absolutely. You see when people describe Manny, they would use phrases like gentle, peaceful. Rose, at one point, his wife, said that Manny would walk 5 blocks out of his way to avoid an argument. So, in terms of someone who would eventually be accused of being a criminal, it was really mind-boggling to people who know him, who knew him at the time.
Right. So the catalyst, really, that sets everything off here is a robbery that happens on July 9th, 1952, at the Jackson Heights branch of the Prudential Insurance Company. Can you describe what happened that day?
Sure. So this was, as you say, July 9th, 1952. And basically what happens is, this is during the lunch hour around 12:30 that day, a man walks into the Prudential office. He's wearing a tan sport shirt. He's got a coat draped over his right arm. And he waits in line. And, it's kind of a light crowd at the Prudential office, I guess, because it was lunchtime. A number of the employees were out for their lunch break. And he walks up to the cashier. Sitting behind the public window is a 26-year-old woman named Constance Ello, who a resident of Long Island City. And the man basically demands the money in the cash drawer. And even though there's no gun visible, the woman, Constance Ello, perceives the man to be holding a gun. And so she starts gathering up stacks of $5 bills from the cash drawer and hands them over, and basically turns over a total of about $200. Meanwhile, as this is happening, another employee returns she had been in the ladies' room. She returns and she kind of walks by the public window. She hears the man say the word cash. She sees Ello kind of clutching the counter in anxiety and senses that something is wrong. She goes to tell the manager of the office, basically saying, something's going on out there. I don't like the looks of that man. But by that point, as the supervisor comes out of the office, the culprit is gone, having collected the $200, and disappears into the crowds surrounding the building.
Now, that happened in July. And it's just a few months later, right, that Manny also makes a trip to that very same Prudential office.
Yeah, so Manny actually went to the office in January of 53. And basically, the visit was born of financial distress. There were a couple of things that led to that financial distress. In December of 1952, Manny had some impacted wisdom teeth that became infected, and that became a very expensive issue to treat. So the Balestreros were already having some financial challenges in December. And, Manny made a pretty good salary at the Stork Club, but he certainly wasn't rich. And so, when medical issues or dental issues came up like this, they were challenging. And then what happened, his wife, Rose, herself experienced some serious dental problems. And the dentist estimated that the cost of treatment was going to be about $325. And they didn't have the money to pay for it. So what Manny decided to do was he and Rose actually had insurance policies with Prudential. They had one for each of the two of them, and then they actually had policies on their children as well. So Manny decided to go to the insurance office to seek a loan against Rose's policy. And the hope was that he could get the loan, that he could use the proceeds from the loan to pay for Rose's dental work.
And so he shows up, and he is basically identified by the woman helping him as the man who had robbed her months earlier. And it was the same woman that had actually assisted Manny during his previous visit to the office, right?
Yeah, well, actually, a number of the women had seen Manny before because he did come in on occasion to pay the premiums on the policies. In this case, the woman who was waiting on him, actually, this is part of the interesting story of the eyewitnesses in this case, the woman who waited on him, a woman named Joan Cope, was actually not in the office at Prudential on the day of the July 9th robbery. The office, though, had been robbed a second time by the same man in December of 1952. And she had been, Joan Cope, that is, the woman waiting on Manny, had been in the office that second day. So what happens when Manny comes into the office is that Joan Cope looks at him and comes to the conclusion that he is the holdup man, that he was the man who she saw when he robbed the office, the man who robbed the office on December 18th of 1952. So basically, as Manny, inquires here, she is starting to, have her anxiety spike and, excuses herself for a minute, goes sort of toward the back of the office and starts sharing her conclusion about Manny with other employees, including Constance Ello, who is, the woman who was at the public window during that first robbery I described, and also at the second, during the second robbery. So this belief that Manny is a holdup man sort of starts spreading through the office, and the women who are working there all come to the conclusion that Manny is the holdup man. Basically, what happens then is that the woman who's waiting on him, Joan Cope, comes back, tells Manny, doesn't reveal, her suspicions at that point to Manny. Manny is kind of has no idea what's happening here. He doesn't even know that this office had been robbed twice before, so he doesn't really realize that he's walked into a crime scene here. And she basically tells him that she thinks that he possibly could get a loan of about $300, but that he'll have to come back with Rose because it's her policy, and she'll have to be involved in the seeking of the loan. So Manny thanks her and goes about his business. He does some grocery shopping. Life seems to continue as normal for him initially. But meanwhile, the employees of the office who have concluded that Manny is the holdup man from these two robberies, they relay their suspicions to the office supervisor. The office supervisor calls the Prudential Home Office in Newark. They contact the police. And, that sets in motion the apparatus of the criminal justice system against Manny Balestrero.
Yeah. We haven't really talked about the Hitchcock film yet, but But I have to say that the scene in the film where he's identified by the women working at the office, the tension is so palpable, intense, as they kind of huddle around to confer about his identity and to confirm his identity. It's just a brilliantly directed and acted scene, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that scene is only about 3 minutes long, as I recall, or maybe even a little bit less. And in such a short period, Hitchcock captures so much of what happened here. The idea that the women were influencing each other. And if you look at you dig into the trial testimony, which I'm sure we'll get to, you can see that that scene is very true to what happened in real life, that essentially the first employee who recognized Manny spread that belief around the office, and there was a rush to judgment in that office, and the other employees, as the movie depicts, really did not have a good view of Manny at all during that January 13th visit. They were sitting back at desks that were fairly far away from the public counter where Manny was standing. And in the movie, this is, as you say, I agree that Hitchcock really does this brilliantly. He constantly cuts back and forth between the subjective view of the employees, which we can see are obstructed. In some cases, they're obstructed by each other. They really don't have a good view of Manny at all. And he's then contrasting that with a more objective view. And you can see that, there's really a kind of a recklessness in how quickly they come to the conclusion that Manny's the holdup man without really having a good view of him at all. So yeah, that's one of the more memorable sequences in the film.
Right. And I guess as long as we're on the subject of the film, it's very unique, right? In the sense that Hitchcock set out to attempt to create a movie as historically accurate as he could.
That's correct. I mean, Hitchcock, as you may remember, comes on at the beginning of the film in a prologue. He sort of forgoes his normal cameo and instead comes on with a prologue, and he essentially assures the audience that everything they're about to see is true. And that turns out to be a bit of an overstatement. There are some variances from the record that Hitchcock engages in here, but overall, it's a very authentic and accurate depiction of what happened. And if we kind of use this as an example, the scene we're talking about, there was a tremendous amount of research that went into the film, and the filmmaking team interviewed a lot of the participants in the actual events, including several of the Prudential Insurance Company employees. So that, when you go into the archives at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, where I was able to get some materials from the Wrong Man file, you can link up the depiction of these events in the movie to the research that was done. And it was actually very helpful from a research point of view because, some of the interview notes that came out of that process were very helpful in reconstructing the events for the book. But yeah, Hitchcock essentially set out to do something he had not done before. He had made many films that were premised on the idea of a person who's been falsely accused of a crime. But in most of those other films, the end game was escapism. It was adventure. There were lots of set pieces. And they were thrillers. They were escapist entertainment in many cases. Great films in my view, but really different from this movie, where Hitchcock really did attempt to reconstruct the events with a great deal of fidelity to the record. He filmed a lot of the events. He filmed a lot of the scenes rather in the actual locales where they unfolded. So you would see scenes that were filmed in the New York City subway, in outside the police precinct where Manny was ultimately brought, in the courthouses. There were people cast in the movie who were actually involved in the events in some cases, like the court reporter or the courtroom attendant. So all of these elements combine to give a great deal of authenticity to the film. in a way that Hitchcock had really not achieved before.
And in a way that we really haven't seen since, right? I mean, of course, it's a drama with actors and dialogue, but it's almost documentary-like in its realism, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's very documentary-like in terms of its attempt to be faithful to the actual events. Again, there were some liberties taken, which we can discuss, but in terms of the core events that are depicted and the reasons why this miscarriage of justice happened, I find it to be very authentic. Stylistically, I think in some cases, you have what I think of as some of the normal, some of the classic Hitchcock touches. There are some scenes where, I wouldn't call the style of the filmmaking documentary-like, because, there's a lot of Hitchcock's artistry involved in sort of the way he sets up some of the shots. But in terms of the presentation of the events and, the idea that as you're watching this, you can really believe that you're seeing an accurate depiction of what happened, I think this movie is unique among all his movies.
So Manny Balestrero is taken to the 110th Precinct station. He's booked. The detectives seem eager to pin this on him. Can you walk us through the methods these detectives used to try and connect Manny to the holdups?
Sure. So this is the day after the visit to the insurance office. So now we're at January 14th of 1953. Manny that day had gone to see his parents in Union City, New Jersey, and basically was arriving home, a little before 6:00, going to take out his keys. And that's when he hears the detectives call out from behind him, "Hey, Chris." Chris being a version of his given name, Christopher. His full name is Christopher Emmanuel Balestrero. And essentially, he sees three detectives approaching him, and they tell him they want to come down to the 110th. They don't at first tell him why. They use the phrase that, they want to talk to him about a routine matter. And Manny is kind of shell-shocked. He doesn't know what's going on, as you say. He never actually even alerts Rose to what's happening. And he's brought down to the precinct. And at that point, once they're at the 110th, the detectives, for the first time, revealed to him that they are investigating a series of neighborhood robberies. And they have received some information suggesting that Manny looks like the person who committed these robberies. They don't actually get into the specifics of the Prudential robberies, but the fact that they kind of present the issue that way is itself important, because what the detectives believed at the time was that whoever committed the Prudential robberies was in fact responsible for a whole group of robberies of neighborhood liquor stores and grocery stores, drug stores. And so they tell him this, and that they basically say, Manny says, "Well, this is, ridiculous. I have nothing to do with these holdups." And, the detectives assure him that if he's done nothing wrong, he has nothing to worry about. He has nothing to fear, but he could help them out if he would go with them to these various establishments in the Jackson Heights neighborhood for possible identification. And this sets off a series of what we call show-ups. I mentioned before the display of a suspect before an eyewitness. Essentially, what the police do is they take him in their squad car and they start parading him before the proprietors of these various stores that have been robbed. And the routine, which is I think fairly accurately depicted in the movie in a pretty memorable way, is that the detectives have him walk into the stores before these proprietors and walk up and down the aisles, walk the length of the store, in the hope that the proprietors would identify him as the holdup man. This happens, I think, about maybe 8 to 10 times that evening. None of the proprietors identify Manny as the holdup man. So the detectives, having apparently concluded from the get-go that Manny is guilty of the Prudential robberies based on the eyewitness identifications, had hoped to be able to pin these other robberies on him, but no identifications are made as a result of these show-up procedures. So they go back to the 110th precinct, and now back at the precinct, the detectives now, reveal for the first time the specifics of the Prudential holdups and the claim that has been made by these employees at the Prudential Insurance Office that he is the man who held up the office on July 9th and December 18th. And, they start asking him if he was in the office that day. Manny denies it. Manny, acknowledges, of course, that he was in the office on January 13th, the day before. He explains why he was there. But again, Manny is just stunned that he's being accused of these crimes. The detectives, clearly don't believe him. And now we move into sort of the second phase of the identification procedures, which is that the detectives have brought to the station two of the employees from the Prudential office, one of whom is Constance Ello, the woman I mentioned who was at the public counter during both of the robberies. And she and another woman named Yolanda Casagrande are assembled. They're in a room. They're put in a room across from where Manny is. The room is a dark room, apparently because Ello was very kind of worried about retribution from the person she would be accusing of a crime. So apparently the detectives indulged her by keeping her and her colleague in the dark. So they're sitting in a room, and the detectives then stage, yet another show-up procedure. Essentially what they do is they put Manny in a doorway that's visible to these two employees, and they tell him to, put on the same overcoat that he had worn the day before, the same scarf, the same hat. And he is then sort of displayed without, I don't think Manny even knew what was happening, but he's being displayed before these two witnesses. And, the women from across the hall confirm to the police that they believe he is the man who held up the office. So at that point, the detectives have two eyewitness identifications, such as they are, and they then move to sort of the next phase of the interrogation, which is something I didn't mention earlier, but for context, during the second robbery in December, the holdup man passed a note to the Prudential teller, Constance Ello, when he walked in to rob the office. The note essentially said, this is a gun I have pointing at you, be quiet, you will not be hurt. Give me the money from the cash drawer. So the police have this note because it was, left at the crime scene by the culprit. And so what they want Manny to do, they want to take a handwriting sample, collect the handwriting sample from Manny to be able to compare his handwriting to the actual holdup note that was passed during the second robbery. So essentially what happens is that one of the detectives dictates the note, and they instruct Manny to use block letters and to write verbatim what the detective is saying. And they do this 6 times. He is asked to write the holdup note. 6 times the detective reads the words, he writes it down. And on the 6th version, when Manny gets to the last part of the holdup note where he is told to write down, give me the money from the cash drawer, Manny misspells the word drawer. He spells it D-R-A-W instead of D-R-A-W-E-R. And as it turns out, that is the same spelling mistake that was made by the holdup man. The original holdup note, the word drawer is misspelled D-R-A-W. So at that point, the detectives, if to the extent there was any doubt on their part, they kind of seize on this and point out to Manny that he's made this mistake, that it replicates the mistake in the holdup note, and that essentially they start, pressuring him to confess to the crime.
Right, yeah. And during the lineup the police set up for witnesses, they didn't have enough suspects to put into the lineup, so they used policemen whose police trousers, for example, would be showing.
Correct. And actually, in the sequence of events, I think that the full lineup happened right after the holdup note, that incident that I just described. But you're absolutely right that what we have here is not a lineup that anyone would say was a fair attempt to test the ability of these eyewitnesses to identify Manny. First of all, you start with the problem that they had already been exposed to Manny in the show up standing alone before the full lineup was even assembled. So right off the bat, the whole process was fatally contaminated. But you're right that when they then assemble a full lineup, and interestingly, they only do this after the assistant district attorney arrives on the scene. He's sort of the person presiding over the lineup. And there are other detectives or other people from the police station are included in the lineup. And the worst part, the part that really captures the problems with this lineup, is that in addition to the detectives being in the lineup, they include in the lineup the husband of one of the eyewitnesses. Constance Ello, one of the two witnesses who's down at the precinct at this point, as I mentioned, she had a lot of anxiety about the prospect of identifying the holdup man. So she wanted her husband to come down to the station with her when the detectives picked her up. So the husband is down there, and as you say, there weren't exactly diligent efforts made to assemble a fair lineup here. And what they do is they put the husband in the lineup so that the eyewitness is being shown a lineup that includes her husband, which is staggeringly unfair. But not surprisingly, the two employees pick Manny out of the lineup without hesitation. And it's at that point that Manny is booked, he's fingerprinted, and he's placed in a holding cell overnight.
Yeah. So Henry Fonda plays Manny in the film. And you were talking about one of the more memorable scenes, which was when he was forced to parade through the stores that were held up. And Fonda's performance in this scene, it's just so powerful. The fear, the confusion, it's humiliating all at once. For me, it was one of the most suspenseful parts of the whole film.
I agree that Henry Fonda's performance in this movie, I think, is fantastic, in part because Fonda had been in a lot of movies that dealt with similar themes. He had been in a couple of movies in the 30s, Let Us Live, You Only Live Once, where he'd been falsely accused of a crime. He had dealt with a lot of social justice issues, but he had an incredible range as an actor. When you watch some of those other movies, including The Grapes of Wrath, another classic social justice film, he could play gentle and basic decency and project all of that. But he also, in some of the other movies, had a certain capacity for rage, an element of danger. And this movie, he completely suppresses that, so that when you're watching the scenes you're describing where he's being paraded before the eyewitnesses and he's being subjected to this surreal series of events, the fact is that, he captures the abject terror of what that must be like. And, the way that he's constantly, looking back over his shoulder, the way you can see the emotions, the sort of the shame, as you say, coursing through him. It really is a performance where Fonda, I think, just absolutely disappears into the character. And that's part of what I think makes this movie as authentic as it is, because there's been so many movies where Hollywood depicts innocent people who are falsely accused. And if you think of the classic movie, The Fugitive, right, where it's Harrison Ford, which I think is a great movie, but basically it turns the victim of false accusation into an action hero, and he spends the movie, escaping and sets out to prove his own innocence. Well, this movie is Henry Fonda giving a performance that captures what Manny Balestrero was actually going through and captures the fact that, when you're falsely accused of a crime like this, it is just an earthquake in your life. And I think that it can't be overstated how effective Fonda is in conveying that in his performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So while Manny is undergoing this traumatic, confusing process with the police, his wife Rose is having her own difficult time coping with what is happening to her husband.
Yes. And in fact, I was able to interview Greg Balestrero, one of Manny's sons, for the book. And even though Greg was very young at the time, he has a pretty vivid memory of what was going on in the house at that point. And Greg mentioned that there was a lot of crying that night in the house when Manny didn't come home. Manny was so dependable in his routines that when he didn't show up at the normal hour, anxiety really began to set in very quickly at the house. And Rose started calling around to see if maybe there had been a bus accident, because he had, the last she had seen him, he was off to Union City to visit his parents. So maybe there was an accident that happened. And there was kind of an increasing anxiety over a period of, an hour or two. And then what happened was one of the detectives from the 110th precinct shows up at the house. And this is the first time that Rose realizes or learns what's going on, because the detective basically shows up and says, at first, Manny sent me to get his blue overcoat. And what that is a reference to is that the holdup man during both of these robberies at the Prudential office had a blue overcoat. So they wanted to see whether they could find the blue overcoat in the Balestrero's home in Jackson Heights, which, as it turns out, Manny did not have a blue overcoat. He only had the gray overcoat that he was wearing down at the precinct, which Rose, quickly pointed out to the detective. The other thing that detectives were hoping to find was the holdup note, I guess, came out of a loose leaf notebook of some sort. So they were also asking about the notebook. That also was not found. But in the course of the detectives, asking these questions, he ultimately reveals to Rose that Manny has been accused of these Prudential holdups. And of course, Rose is absolutely shocked and, insists to the detectives that, Manny must not have had anything to do with any of this. But that's how Rose learns of where Manny is.
So amidst all of this despair, all is not completely lost for Manny. He does have people who rally around him, including his boss at the Stork Club.
Correct. I mean, that's one of the, this story is a harrowing story and one that, is a cautionary tale and has certain elements that are somewhat depressing. But one of the more positive parts of this story is that Manny did get a lot of support from his friends, from his family members, from his employer. And, you did have this situation where, as you say, the Stork Club, basically what happened was after Manny retained his lawyer, Frank O'Connor, started investigating the matter and became convinced of Manny's innocence and relayed that to Billingsley, the owner of the Stork Club, and Manny was permitted to return to work. So you had what I think of as a very surreal situation, which is you have a man who has been accused by the state of, by the state of New York of these crimes, and yet he is still employed by a club that is servicing some of the most famous people in the world. And later, when Manny looks back on this whole experience, he talks about the fact that one of the most positive things that came out of, or maybe perhaps one of the only positive things that came out of this experience, was the fact that people stood by him. Although I will note that it was not universal, because in talking to his son, Greg Greg said that, there were, as much as Manny did get a lot of support, and as much as the people who knew Manny knew it was preposterous that Manny would hold up the Prudential Insurance Office, there were some naysayers. Greg kind of described the allegations against Manny as similar to a grenade going off at an Easter dinner. And there were people who, had some skepticism about it. But overall, most of his friends and family did stand by him.
Did Manny have an alibi?
Yes. In fact, we were talking about some of the earlier cases where people were wrongfully convicted in the 10 to 15 years before this case, where alibis were ignored by the criminal justice system. This was another case where Manny had very powerful alibis. Essentially, if we go to the first robbery, the July 9th robbery, Manny was on vacation at the time at a farm near Cornwall, New York, which is about 60 miles from Jackson Heights. And, he had, I think it was like a 5-day vacation. So he had already been up there for a few days by July 9th. And this is actually something that Rose realized very early on when Rose was at the arraignment and learned of the 2 dates of the alleged robberies. On July 9th, the Balestreros were at this vacation farm. As it happens, it was a rainy day that day, and there wasn't a lot to do as a result. I mean, sounds like there weren't tons of things to do at this farm in general. There was a lot of card playing, there was bocce, there was a large dining room for big meals and all that. But on a rainy day, I guess, Manny and his 2 sons didn't have a lot to do. So as it turned out, around 11 o'clock that day, another guest at the farm, a guy named Carl Werkner, wanted to go to Cornwall, the village of Cornwall, which was near the farm, to mail a letter to his brother in Germany. And he was going with his daughter, and Manny basically asked if he could come along with his sons because they had nothing else to do. And this guy Werkner says, sure, hop in. And they go together to the post office, and they return to this farm at around 12:30, at which point they then assemble in the dining room for lunch. Now, the crime is unfolding at the Prudential office in Jackson Heights, 60 miles away, right around this time. And Manny is seen by multiple people in the dining room. The owner of the farm, a man named Enrico Ferrero, remembered seeing Manny in the dining room. And, you might ask, well, how could he remember July 9th at this point? By the time Manny's accused of the crime, of course, we're now looking back at events that occurred, more than 6 months ago. And so sometimes there might be a skepticism. Well, how would someone remember the exact date? Well, it turns out that July 9th was the birthday of the man's wife. And he remembered making a birthday cake that day. He also remembered that his wife fell ill and she didn't turned out she couldn't come to the lunch, but he remembered Manny in the dining room. So right away, you had these 2 alibi witnesses. You had Werkner, the guy who drove Manny and his sons into Cornwall. You had the owner of the farm. And these were pretty detailed alibis. And, Frank O'Connor, the lawyer, in preparing Manny's defense, was able to secure sworn statements from these 2 men. For the second robbery, which was in December, there was sort of 2 elements to the alibi, one of which is really interesting. I think I mentioned Manny had dental problems in December, and he had impacted wisdom teeth. And shortly before, in the days leading up to the December robbery, Manny actually developed an infection in his wisdom teeth and had to be treated for that. The doctor prescribed penicillin, and the result, unexpectedly, was that Manny had an allergic reaction to the penicillin, and he wound up with a very swollen jaw. So at the time of the second robbery, one of the Stork Club people in Manny's band even remembered that you could see from 15 feet away that Manny's jaw was very swollen. So this became important because none of the eyewitnesses to the December holdup said anything about the person having a swollen jaw, the holdup man. But in addition to that, on the date of the second robbery, Manny was home in his pajamas at the time of the holdup, and his older son, Robert, returned home from school during the lunch hour. And he was a alibi witness, or a potential alibi witness, because he remembered being with Manny at that time. So there were these two elements to Manny's defense for the second robbery that were related to his swollen jaw and the fact that his son and his obviously his wife as well remembered that he was home at the time.
Yeah, these alibis, especially the one on July 9th, is pretty airtight for Manny. But the DA still wants to try him for the crime, and that means calling the women who identified him at the Prudential office to the stand. And part of the prosecution's strategy is to create some courtroom drama. And the DA instructs the first witness, when she identifies him, he instructs her to go right up to him and put her hand on his shoulder.
Yes, and the movie depicts that in a very memorable way, and it's all accurate. It was a ritual that prosecutors used in criminal cases at the time, and I saw the same ritual repeated in a number of the earlier cases that I talk about in the book, where they ask the witness to step down off the stand, walk over the defendant in the courtroom, and put their hand on the defendant's shoulder. And I gather the idea was it's sort of a way of, obviously it's an element of theatrics. It is intended to convey the eyewitness's certainty at that point. And you're right that by the time we get to trial in April of 1953, this case is all about the eyewitnesses from the state's point of view. The handwriting piece of the case, which we can get to in a moment, sort of falls out of the case for interesting reasons. But there are, when Frank Crisona, the assistant district attorney, gives his opening statement, he promises that there will be 4 eyewitnesses who will positively identify Manny as the holdup man. And the first of the witnesses is Constance Ello, the woman who signed the criminal complaint, the woman who was at the public window during both robberies. And the moment you describe is probably the most memorable moment of the trial, because you had 2 people who were absolutely terrified. You had Ello, the witness, who at one point told the reporter that she was afraid of being, quote unquote, bumped off as a result of the fact that she's testifying against someone she believed to be a criminal. And, her anxiety is just soaring, as far as I can tell from the contemporaneous accounts of this trial. The Life magazine account of the case basically says she nearly fainted when she's asked to walk over to Manny. Meanwhile, Manny himself is terrified at this point. And Frank O'Connor, his lawyer, later describes the fact that Manny's, his hands are shaking under the table and he's clutching O'Connor's hands for support. So, yeah, that was, Ello was the first witness. And the prosecution's basic game plan is to repeat the process with the other witnesses. Now, by the time the second witness comes on and the prosecutor asks her to do the same thing, the judge has sort of seen enough. The judge basically says that's not necessary. Judge Grote, William Grote, the presiding judge. And so it's not repeated, but it is something that went on a lot in these eyewitness cases. And it is one of the more dramatic moments of the trial as depicted in the film.
Yeah. O'Connor did a pretty good job, though, right? In defending Manny. He was getting the witnesses to admit that they weren't entirely sure that it was Manny who held them up. And in one instance, I believe hair color became a point of contention.
Yeah, the first witness, this Constance Ello, O'Connor was able to score at least some debating points on cross-examination. You don't really see this in the film, but O'Connor had done a tremendous amount of preparation and investigation into this case. And you do see that in the trial transcript. In the case of Constance Ello, he had gotten a copy of the statement that she had given to police and had seen that she had told the police that the man who robbed her had blonde or light brown hair. At that point during the trial, the jury sort of, she acknowledges that, and then the jury sort of looks over and they see that, Manny has pretty dark hair. So there was a gap between the statement and, Manny's appearance. O'Connor also brought out the fact that she told the police that the holdup man she would estimate to be about 35, and Manny at that point was 43 years old. And then he also cross-examined her about the lineup, and she at first insisted that she didn't know anyone in the lineup, but then O'Connor did bring out at the trial the fact that her husband was in the lineup, the point we talked about earlier. So there was some ground that O'Connor made up on cross, but it's not clear that he was making a lot of headway with the jury. And I think here we go back to the fact that the legal culture at the time so exalted eyewitness testimony that when you came in with 4 eyewitnesses, there was this sense that how could 4 eyewitnesses be wrong about this? And in fact, we talked about the alibis and how strong they were. Well, O'Connor brought those alibis to the prudential people. He brought them to the district attorney's office, and they just wouldn't have any of it. They just refused to entertain the idea that the 4 eyewitnesses could be wrong. And you could see the same phenomenon play out in some of the earlier mistaken identity cases that led up to this one. So, while O'Connor did score some of these points on cross-examination, it's not clear that he was, at least as far as they got in the trial, convincing the jury that Manny was innocent.
Right, yeah. I want to ask you as well, a police handwriting expert was called to testify, not surprisingly, and a big piece of evidence in this case was that note and the alleged similarities between Manny's handwriting and the handwriting on the original note. But the handwriting expert's testimony was not exactly the slam dunk the prosecution was looking for, right?
Correct. The handwriting expert, a detective named Hugh Sang, I guess the term of art that was used back then was examiner of question documents. That's what they called the handwriting specialists. And O'Connor was bracing for a pretty strong opinion coming from the handwriting expert because, as you say, it seemed as if the prosecution and the police had relied so heavily on the handwriting samples at the time of the arrest. In fact, if we flash back a moment to the 110th precinct the night Manny was arrested, when the assistant district attorney came in, Thomas Cullen, to try to pressure Manny to confess, he looked at the handwriting samples and compared it to the note and basically told Manny, this looks identical to me. So, you really should do yourself some good here and confess to these crimes. So, O'Connor had prepared for a lengthy battle with this handwriting expert on the assumption that he was going to testify that Manny's handwriting matched the handwriting in the note. And it turned out he didn't do that. The detective Sang, the specialist, basically said he could not form a conclusion one way or the other about whether Manny wrote the note. He said there were some similarities, there were some differences. And, this clearly came as a surprise to O'Connor, who I think strategically didn't really know what to do at this point. And basically the prosecutor brought this witness on, and the direct testimony lasted for, 5 minutes. And at that point, the judge says to O'Connor, "You don't have any questions, do you?" And O'Connor says, "Well, actually, I do, Your Honor." And the judge clearly sort of trying to steer O'Connor away from pursuing this, because I think he saw that, this witness had taken that the handwriting element of the case had been eliminated at that point. But nonetheless, and this turns out, I think, to be a fateful decision in Manny's life, although you wouldn't know it at the time, O'Connor decides to embark on a very long cross-examination of this handwriting expert, and essentially trying to get the witness to go a step further, trying to get him to admit that because he could not say that the same person, that he cannot say definitively that Manny wrote the holdup note, that necessarily it must have been written by someone else. And so you get this, I think, I remember plowing through this in a trial transcript, and this goes on for, I think it must have been like 100 pages of testimony, where O'Connor pulls out a treatise by a handwriting expert and is reading passages from it and trying to get this witness to agree or disagree with certain propositions of law. And ultimately, nothing really comes of it. But it is noteworthy that, the police condemned Manny at the 110th precinct that night because he made the spelling mistake in the 6th version of the holdup note. And that spelling mistake is not mentioned at all by the prosecution, because their handwriting expert just wasn't unable to assert an expert opinion to the effect that Manny wrote the note.
Right. And I do want to mention to listeners that you do include photos of the notes side by side in your book for anyone who wants to examine them and make their own judgment. So I do want to ask you about this. It was a really interesting moment in the trial. A couple of the jurors began getting frustrated with the length of time O'Connor was taking in his questioning. Can you tell us more about what happened with those jurors?
Sure. So as context sort of in the timeline of the trial, the handwriting expert has now gotten off the stand after this extended cross-examination that doesn't really seem to amount to much in the end. And now O'Connor is now cross-examining the third eyewitness to testify, a woman named Yolanda Casagrande, who was present in the prudential office during both of the holdups. And, at that point, one can speculate, but, it's not hard to imagine that the handwriting cross-examination was seen as a little bit overlong, by some of these jurors. But in any event, now O'Connor is cross-examining this third eyewitness, and he's trying to get her to admit that she didn't really have a good opportunity to observe the holdup man. And then he starts cross-examining her about the lineup at the 110th precinct. And at this point, the witness is being a little bit difficult. It's really the cross-examination is getting a little bit long. And suddenly O'Connor hears a whisper coming from the jury box. And he believes what he hears is one of the jurors say, "Do we have to listen to this nonsense?" But he continues because it's a whisper, and it was not something that caught the attention of the judge or apparently others in the courtroom. But then almost immediately after the whispered comment, another juror rises and says out loud, "Your Honor, do we have to sit here and listen to this?" And this, of course, is a shocking development for a juror to erupt in frustration this way and ask the judge if they have to keep hearing the testimony. The judge reacts, strongly at first by admonishing the juror, basically saying that the court will be the judge of what's proper evidence. And the juror sits down. And this is where the movie diverges a little bit from what actually happened. In the actual trial, O'Connor continues on with the cross-examination for a little bit after that happens. He does not immediately move for a mistrial. Then there's a lunch recess. O'Connor at this point is debating whether to move for a mistrial. I mean, he knows on the one hand that the jurors' comments are more than problematic, that they reflect a predisposition, to say the least, on the part of these two jurors against Manny. They've obviously not heard all the evidence yet, but the fact that they are frustrated and bored by O'Connor's cross-examination of the eyewitnesses would suggest that they don't think they need to hear much more. And one can assume that they were prepared to, enter a guilty verdict sooner than later. But O'Connor hesitates in part because by this point, Manny was really on the brink of collapse. His wife, Rose, herself, by this point, has had a nervous breakdown. And Manny was forced to move her into a sanitarium for mental health treatment. Manny himself is undergoing psychiatric care because the anxiety from this whole ordeal has just been absolutely crippling. He's not sleeping. He's, afraid to go out in public. And O'Connor really questioned whether Manny would have the fortitude really to start over, which is what would have to happen if there's a mistrial, right? The whole trial would be wiped away and they'd have to go through this all again. But in the end, O'Connor realizes that he has no choice. So when they come back from the lunch recess, he makes a motion for a mistrial. He basically argues that the jurors had made these comments, that shows their impatience. They had formed an opinion as to Manny's probable guilt. And at this point, the mistrial should be declared. The judge, interestingly enough, pushes back on this pretty hard at first. He tells O'Connor he doesn't share that conclusion that they formed an opinion. But basically, the judge says he wants to consider this issue and he's going to adjourn for the day. This is now on the second day of trial. So the proceedings adjourned, and then they come back the following day. And at this point, the judge hears some argument from O'Connor, and critically, the assistant district attorney, basically tells the court he does not oppose the motion. So while if the motion had been opposed, it's not clear what the judge might have done. But faced with O'Connor's request for a mistrial, faced with a lack of opposition from the ADA on the case, he declares a mistrial.
Yeah. And you do write in your book that some of the jury members were interviewed after the mistrial was declared, and it sounded like they were ready to find Manny guilty. So the mistrial really worked in his favor.
Right. That's how I would view it. I mean, there's no way to know for sure, but in terms of, the evidence that we do have, or the information that we have, the Daily News reporter who was covering the trial said that they had polled the jury and that the jury would have voted to convict. There was a reporter for another paper, for the Long Island Star Journal, who was very sympathetic to Manny, who'd been covering the case for a while. He wrote later on that he felt the jury would not have believed Manny's alibis. There were some, I was able to find in the archives of the film, the Wrong Man Files at the Margaret Herrick Library in California. There were some notes of interviews with two of the jurors. One man on the jury said he was convinced of Manny's innocence, but that he was the only person who felt that way. Now, of course, that could be a self-serving look back, now that at that point he obviously knew that Manny was innocent, so it's not clear. But the other juror who had been interviewed by the filmmaker said he wasn't sure. But of course, the fact is that one of the things the movie isn't strictly precise about is that, in the movie you just see the one juror get up and make the comment that leads to the mistrial. But as I mentioned, there were actually two jurors who basically said the equivalent of, do we have to listen to this nonsense anymore? Referring to O'Connor's cross-examination. So it did not look good for Manny, I would say. I would say, based on the best information available, it looked like he was headed for a conviction, but there's no way to know for sure because, in part, by that point in the trial, we only had seen some of the prosecution witnesses. O'Connor had not yet put on his alibi witnesses. And so, there's no way to know for sure what would have happened.
So how does Charles Danielle enter the picture?
Well, what happens is on April 29th, 1953, I mean, that is another fateful day in Manny's life. A few different things happen. The court sets a new trial, and the new trial date is going to be July 13th. That day, Manny and his sons go to visit Rose. She's still at the sanitarium. And actually, Rose sort of implores Manny to take her home that day, but she's not well enough to come home. And Manny has to tell her that. But basically, Manny asks Rose to pray that this ordeal will get resolved and they'll all be together again. And Rose promises to do that. And then that night, a 38-year-old man walks into a deli in Astoria, Queens. And that is Charles Danielle, the man you mentioned. He orders some cold cuts from the woman behind the counter. She's the co-owner of the deli. Frida Mank is her name. And then the man pulls a gun and demands the money in the cash drawer. But as it turned out, he picked the wrong deli to try to hold up, because Frida Mank, rather than just comply with the demand to turn over the cash, her first move is to grab a butcher knife and assume a defensive position. And then she stamps her feet to signal her husband, who's in the cellar at the time. I guess they had worked this out in advance, because they had seen this man loitering outside the deli and had become somewhat suspicious. So she signals to him. She's sort of facing off with this holdup man. And the husband, having received the signal, calls the police, comes upstairs. And, the accounts of what happened from this point forward vary a little bit. But essentially what happens is the police arrive on the scene and subdue the man who had been holding the gun and demanding the cash. Turns out the gun was a toy, and the man who was holding the gun was a 38-year-old plastic molder named Charles Danielle, who would soon be labeled in the newspapers as the toy gun bandit as a result of this episode. And Danielle is taken to the station, local police station, and he promptly confesses to 40 robberies, including the 2 Prudential holdups. And he actually says to the police that, he had read about Manny's ordeal and was going to try to find some way to clear him. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll never know. But nonetheless, he confesses, and that confession ultimately leads to Manny's exoneration.
So you do include in your book the photos of both men, and there is some resemblance between them, but they're certainly not even remotely identical. There are some pretty obvious differences. Why do you think it was so hard for witnesses to distinguish between the two men?
Yeah, my take is that reports of their resemblance was grossly exaggerated. When the newspapers reported on Manny's exoneration, almost without fail, they referred to Charles Danielle as Manny's double, or twin is another phrase that was used. And when you look at the 2 photos side by side, I think your characterization is correct. There is some resemblance, but I don't believe it to be a strong resemblance. First of all, Manny was about 5 years older. And while both of the men have, somewhat high foreheads, Charles Danielle, his hair was receding much more significantly. So, the hairlines were very different. His hair was lighter. And, I think there was some similarity around the eyes. One of the descriptions given to the police was the holdup man had circles under his eyes. And, you could see that a little bit in Manny's headshot. But, the idea that these 2 men were doubles, and that explains the reason for this miscarriage of justice, the reason that Manny was falsely accused, I think in the end turns out to be a narrative that was advanced by the state as a way of trying to explain, the tragedy of what happened here. That essentially the narrative was you had two men who looked remarkably like each other. You had eyewitnesses who made positive identifications. They were sincere, well-meaning witnesses. And this whole tragedy sort of was unavoidable. And, in a way, they also used the supposed spelling mistake. Again, trying to cast the spelling mistake that Manny made as this unbelievable coincidence, and that this other coincidence that Manny happened to look so much like this holdup man is what explains the reason for the false arrest. So the bottom line is, as you say, people can look at the two photos and judge for themselves, but I don't believe there to be a strong resemblance between the two men.
Yeah. So what happens to the Balestrero family? Is there a happy ending for them? And what role does Manny play in the production of the film? What's his relationship with Alfred Hitchcock?
Well, to take the first question, essentially, Manny's exoneration, of course, sets off a jubilant reaction at first with Manny's friends and family, and he's hopeful that this nightmare is over. But in reality, unfortunately, it was not over for him because Rose remained at the sanitarium. It was in Ossining, New York, and she was not well enough to come home at that point. So at this point, Rose was first moved to the sanitarium in February. We are now in late April, early May, and the day after the confession by Charles Danielle, Manny goes to see her in the hope that the news of his exoneration will help aid in her recovery and will enable him to bring her home. But unfortunately, that's not the case. She's not well enough to come home. And in fact, it's not until September of 1955, which, is well over 2 years after Manny's arrest, that she's able to come home. So there's a long period in the aftermath of Manny's exoneration where the family remains separated, and Manny is raising his two sons while Rose remains at the sanitarium. Ultimately, in September of 55, she's able to be reunited with her family, and the Balesteros moved to Miami shortly after that in an attempt to get a fresh start. In terms of what happens next, they move in September of 1955. The movie starts into production in the first part of 1956, and the Ballesteros do cooperate with the production. They sold the rights to their story. They needed the money badly. They had tried in civil litigation to get compensation for the false arrest. And that's a sort of a saga into itself that I get into in the book. But, the upshot of it is that they get a settlement out of Prudential, but it's not for a lot of money given the suffering that they endured. So, getting the money from their film rights is very helpful to them. And they do cooperate. And, Greg Balestrero recalled that before filming started, Hitchcock sent Henry Fonda and Vera Miles, the two leads, to Miami to meet with Manny and Rose and to, get information about their lives, about their experiences, things that might be helpful to them. And, Henry Fonda learned how to play the bass for the movie, at least to some degree. And Greg recalled that Manny was, giving Fonda some lessons in how to hold it and how to play it. So they had a meeting, and this was part of the research process I mentioned earlier, where there was an extensive series of interviews with the participants in the movie. And, at various points after that meeting, either Manny or Rose did talk to the filmmaking team, whether it was one of the screenwriters, the associate producer, to provide information that Hitchcock used to try to bolster the authenticity of the film. So there was certainly cooperation with the film, but in a way, when you talk to Greg about his parents' reaction to the whole experience of the movie being made and to the movie itself, it's very telling, because what he told me was that Manny came to see the film as vindication. That, even though the criminal justice system finally acknowledged by June or July of 1953 that Manny was innocent, and that's when the indictment was finally formally removed, that Manny still felt this sense that perhaps not quite everyone believed he was innocent. And so when the movie came out, it was just a further vindication, and he liked the public nature of it. The fact that Hollywood was now validating his innocence in a way. And Greg said that he came to he saw the movie many times as he got older, and he wanted his friends to see it. On the other hand, Rose never watched the movie. Greg said, Rose did progress with her recovery from this ordeal and from her nervous breakdown, and she did make progress with it. But as Greg put it, she remained in somewhat of a fragile place, even as she got older, and that she never really could revisit the events that are depicted in the movie, and the whole family sort of had to steer away from any reference to it. So Greg basically told me that Rose went to her grave not knowing what's in this film.
Wow, interesting. So the film itself was not a box office success, especially compared to other Hitchcock movies. But many people, including film director Martin Scorsese, he was highly influenced by The Wrong Man. Where do you think the film falls legacy-wise into the history of cinema? And where do you think it should fall?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're absolutely right that when the movie was released, it was seen as a disappointment. The reviews were mixed. There were some favorable reviews, but more often than not, there was a sense that Hitchcock had strayed too far from his normal sort of suspense and thriller elements, and that perhaps he had gotten too carried away with his desire to tell a true story and to be very faithful to the facts. And that was, not only a refrain in some of the criticism, but also it was reflected in the box office. The movie made much less. I think Hitchcock's other release in 1956 was The Man Who Knew Too Much with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day. And that was much more successful and certainly a much more conventional Hitchcock picture. And so for many years, this movie really did fly under the radar in Hitchcock's filmography. But as you say, it has over time been recognized as one of Hitchcock's greatest films by some important people. And Martin Scorsese is certainly one of those people. Scorsese said that when he came time for him to make Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro, that one of the things he looked to create a sense of unease with some of the camera movements was some of the work that Hitchcock did in the scenes we talked about earlier, where Manny is being paraded before the eyewitnesses. And Scorsese, was interviewed in a really good documentary about Hitchcock's, called Hitchcock Truffaut, about the book that Truffaut did of interviews with Hitchcock a few years ago. And Scorsese basically said, he returns to this movie over and over again because he finds it to be such a great film. And I think it really is. I think that when you consider the fact that this movie was made in the 1950s, it has such an authentic depiction of the criminal justice system. And, one of the arguments I make in the book is that if you want to find out about what suspects were experiencing in the criminal justice system at that time, you can get a better sense from watching this film than you can from, for example, some of the reports that were put out about the criminal justice system by, state officials at the time. It's a very unflinching look at what it's like to be falsely accused of a crime, and I think an unflinching look at the state's own culpability in that, in what happened here. And the other thing I think that is really remarkable about the film is it's very prescient. When you watch this movie today, in light of the hundreds of exonerations of innocent people that have come to light in recent years, you see that the movie puts on display a number of the causes of those wrongful convictions. And it's kind of an interesting point to explore when you kind of look at the behavior of the police as depicted in the film, and then you read about, studies of wrongful convictions and look at things like, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, the suggestiveness of police identification procedures, the fact that police show tunnel vision and sort of rushing to judgment with suspects. All of these problems are put on stark display in this movie in a way, and yet in a way that I think is very dramatic and so powerfully acted by Henry Fonda and Vera Miles. So I think over time the movie has gained a lot in esteem, and I think it will continue to do so. And I'm hoping that the book will draw some people to the film who have never seen it before.
Absolutely, yeah. And speaking of the book, it's currently available for pre-order and is officially released on January 14th.
Correct.
And you have a website as well, nothingtofearbook.com.
That's right. You can go there and learn more about the book and more about Manny's case and some of the other cases that are talked about in the sort of the prologue to the book, which, as I said, is, I think, important as context to understanding what Manny experienced in the criminal justice system when he was falsely arrested and prosecuted.
Well, I appreciate you spending so much time with me. A lot of time was spent here covering the actual case, but there's a lot about the making of the film in your book that we didn't get a chance to touch on. But thank you again. It's been so great.
Oh, it's been absolutely my pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Again, I have been speaking to Jason Isralowitz. He is the author of Nothing to Fear, Alfred Hitchcock and the Wrong Men. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe